I'm here today to talk about Senate Bill 509 and a provision that would make its impact even more catastrophic than first thought. Each day we see more examples of how our strategic, fiscally responsible approach is moving Missouri's economy forward. The #1 state for technology job growth in the nation for the last 2 years running. Faster job growth in 7 out of 8 neighboring states. And major investment by global brands and small businesses alike. But right now, our economy and the rock-solid foundation of fiscal certainty on which it rests is at risk. As you know, the responsibility I have as governor to read and thoroughly review every bill that comes to my desk is one I take very seriously. This process is important because this assessment is the last safeguard against flawed legislation becoming the law of the land. Last week, we began our review of Senate Bill 509 and quickly identified a dramatic and far-reaching problem that was not discussed during the public debate about this legislation in the General Assembly. Senate Bill 509, as truly agreed to and finally passed by the legislature, would eliminate income tax on Missourians with income greater than $9,000 a year. That's right, eliminate. Let me explain. Missouri's tax code contains a number of brackets or ranges of income subject to certain levels of taxation. Currently, the top bracket includes all Missourians with incomes over $9,000 a year. Senate Bill 509 says that once this legislation is fully phased in, the top bracket, quote, shall be eliminated. The result of this provision would be to wipe out 97% of all individual income tax collections in the state of Missouri. Given the cataclysmic nature of this provision, we immediately sought an outside independent review to verify our analysis. Washington University law professor Cheryl Block is an expert on individual and corporate tax policy. In fact, she wrote the book on this topic, as her textbook on corporate taxation is now in its 4th edition. For more than 30 years, she has taught classes on tax law, legislation, and statutory interpretation. Professor Block's analysis confirmed that Senate Bill 509 would, quote, completely eliminate the top state personal income tax bracket, and as a result, taxpayers with incomes over $9,000 a year would pay no tax at all. Following this outside legal review, we then had State Budget Director Linda Lubring and the professional staff at the Office of Budget and Planning conduct an analysis of the fiscal impact of this provision. The results were staggering. This provision would ultimately pushing Missouri into fiscal chaos. It is hard to overstate the crippling impact this would have. Senate Bill 509 would force the outright elimination of the most basic services Missourians count on from their government. Teachers would be laid off and schools would shut their doors. Prisons would close. Mental health facilities would be shuttered. And the AAA credit rating we've boasted and boosted for decades would be downgraded. With a simple stroke of my pen, this bill would separate Missouri from every other state in the nation as the only one unable to meet even the most basic obligations to its people. The consequence of a fiscal disaster on this scale would be devastating. And because of the Hancock Amendment, extremely difficult to undo were this bill to become law. That Senate Bill 509 would have catastrophic implications on Missouri families and schools, really there's no question. The only question is how something of this magnitude ended up in a 5-page bill that passed both chambers of the legislature without debate or public discussion of this problem. There are only 2 plausible explanations, and both are equally troubling. Either this provision was an accident, another example of carelessness by legislators unwilling to dedicate the time and effort necessary to avoid grave errors like this, or this provision was placed in the bill deliberately at the behest of ideological interests led by one St. Louis billionaire. These interests have long been determined to shift the tax burden away from themselves and onto middle-class families by eliminating the income tax entirely. Whether the result of gross negligence or purposeful effort to dismantle the tax code and defund public education, only the backers of this ill-conceived bill can know. But regardless of their intent, Senate Bill 509 would devastate our economy, bankrupt our state, cripple our schools, and it cannot become law. This disastrous provision is just another example of what happens when legislation is driven by political gamesmanship rather than thoughtful, transparent policymaking. Missourians know that I have never been opposed to making responsible changes to the tax code. In fact, I've cut taxes 4 times as governor, and Missouri now has the 6th lowest taxes in the nation. But deeply flawed and disastrous measures like Senate Bill 509 have real consequences. And that's why when it comes to the tax code, these changes must be considered in a serious, meticulous, and thoughtful way. Unfortunately, over the past few months, some members have turned the legislative process into a race to see how many tax bills they can put on my desk in as short a period as possible. That is not the right approach. It doesn't produce good policy. As we see here today, it is quite frankly dangerous to our state. For generations, Democrats and Republicans have worked together to protect Missouri's spotless AAA credit rating and keep our state on a fiscally responsible path. Now is not the time to veer off that course. That's why I'm calling on members of the legislature to abandon this dangerous scheme and work with us on a responsible approach, like the one I laid out earlier this year that will protect public education and keep our state moving forward. Now, I thank you, and I'd like to turn over for just a second, just to get a couple quick minutes with Chris Pieper here, then I'll finish up and then be glad to take questions. To go through a quick analysis, Chris, if you would, the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor, Chris Pieper. Chris.
Thank you, Governor. As you can see, these are blow-ups of an excerpt of Senate Bill 509 and 196, just to walk you through some of the provisions that are at issue. If you see here in 143.011, the subsection 1 imposes the tax, and then the brackets here instruct how to calculate the amount of the tax. So for various different levels of income that are represented in the brackets, on the left side, moving over to the right side, shows you what rate and how to calculate the tax. The new language in bold here that is added with 509 calls for a reduction in some of the rates, and it also requires, and this is the highlighted language here, that the bracket for income subject to the top rate, that bracket is eliminated once the tax rate has been reduced to 5.5%. If the bracket on the left side is eliminated pursuant to this sentence, then there's a new top bracket. That bracket is for income over $8,000 but not over $9,000. What that does is it means that there is no income tax bracket that applies to income over $9,000, meaning that such taxpayers are not subject to tax at all.
Thank you, Chris. As you can see right here in black and white, the problems with this bill are clear, and the impact would be dramatic, affecting every basic public service in every corner of our state and shaking our economy. Missourians deserve better. With a few weeks left in the legislative session, it's time for the General Assembly to set aside these misguided schemes and fiscal experiments and work together on policies that will help our economy rather than hurt it. With that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
So, Governor, this bill is so bad, why would you be here today?
Clearly, this bill can't become law, but we're going to take the time afforded us in the days ahead to complete our analysis and communicate with folks about the problems that are here.
Sounds like there's enough analysis already if it's this bad and it's going to do this much work, so why not go ahead and veto it?
Well, I mean, I've laid out what I'm going to do, and I think that making sure that we're able to communicate not just to not just in a small fashion, but to make sure that Missourians understand the import of this decision. It's very important that these legislators hear, not just from their leadership, not just from their various vote count whips, but from their constituents, about how important the fiscal responsibility of their positions and how the tax code is not something to be played with.
Representative Gale said this morning, used the word laughable 3 or 4 times, that your analysis is laughable, that all you're trying to do is use scare tactics, that you're not even reading all of subparagraph 4, you're only picking out part of it, and reading all of subparagraph 4 clearly gives the Revenue Department the authority to fix the line 22 and take away, that makes 8,000 and above the tax bracket, not just 9.
I mean, it's 3 or 4 different subjects to talk about there, but it would strike me as extremely odd that the legislature would want the Department of Revenue to write the tax laws of our state. This is the tax law of our state. They have a responsibility to write those clearly and not make an excuse that some bureaucrat should have to clean up after.